Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graban. My guest today is Professor John Grout. He is the former dean of the Campbell School of Business at Berry College in Rome, Georgia. He's currently the chair of the Technology, Entrepreneurship, and Data Analytics Department, and he's the David C. Garrett Jr. Professor of Business Administration. So John has overseen the development, approval, and implementation of Berry College's Creative Technologies program and Berry's makerspace called HackBerry Lab. So before I tell you a little bit more about him, John, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. Nice to be here.
So, John, I want to tell you a little bit more about his background, and I think when you hear this, you'll know why I invited him to be here today. He's researched something called mistake proofing extensively. He's published numerous articles on mistake proofing. In 2004, John received the Shingo Prize for his paper called The Human Side of Mistake Proofing. And he's also consulted with a large variety of companies to mistake proof their processes. And he also published an ebook that's freely available online. I'll link to it in the show notes. I recommend it. Whether you're working in healthcare or not, it's called Mistake Proofing the Design of Healthcare Processes. And his website is mistakeproofing.com. So, John, with the different things you've done in your career and different departments and things you've done, I'm curious to hear your story. What is your favorite mistake?
Well, I'm glad you called it my favorite mistake, because my favorite mistake actually isn't kind of my biggest or worst or any of that. My mistake was one that I actually try and commit whenever I can. The circumstances was that our creative technologies program was having a contest where we had PVC pipe, pool noodles, and zip ties, and we were supposed to create the tallest tower that we could. So very similar to a lot of kind of engineering exercises or team building exercises that are out there. And I came to it since it was out of my department and I'm department chair. I was thinking, I'm just going to let them do it. But there was a math professor and a physics professor who showed up with their teenage boys, and they were going to try this out. And they said, oh, you should do it too. And so I kind of said, all right. So I jumped into it and started building. And within about a half an hour, I had a structure that was, about 18 feet tall. It was super simple because PVC pipe's 10-foot lengths. Had it up there and then started to add from there. Mm-hmm. And what I found was that when I tried to take my tower and stand it up, that it would bend, and those bends would invariably break all of the connections that I had for this tower.
So you were building it kind of horizontally along the ground and then trying to tilt it up. Is that right?
Exactly right. Yeah. And very early on, I discovered that did not work. And that's my favorite mistake, is the idea that if you make a mistake early, it's low cost, you can recover from it, and things turned out great. Now, I was actually trying to not win this competition because I don't think it's really comely to sponsor an event and then win it. Now, one of my colleagues was administering the event, so I really didn't have any official responsibilities, but I felt like, it would be way better if a student won the prize. The prizes were not, glorious and fantastic, and it wasn't anything like that. But I did feel like certainly someone will beat this. So I worked on my tower, found out that you couldn't stand it up, but rather you had to build it up. And so I got a couple of the lab assistants to help me pick the tower up, put the next section underneath it. And we did that twice, and we were up about 35 feet. I thought that was a respectable showing, but didn't want to blow the competition away. The problem was no one else figured out that you couldn't build it horizontal and then stand it up. And it was a 3-hour exercise, and I was done in an hour and a half. 2.5 hours into the project, everyone was starting to think about standing up their projects, and they all broke, every single one of them. Yeah. And so they had a half hour to try and resolve the issues that they had found. And so I was really lucky because I made a mistake that helped me understand the material I was working with early in the process.
Yeah.
And I tried to make it as simple as possible.
So an accidental victory that was born out of learning from an early mistake. That's such a great story for what we talk about here in the podcast all the time.
Yeah. So, it taught me, because we always talk about kind of a design process where you build a prototype and you iterate and you try and make mistakes early. And we talk about it. And at that point, the program was relatively new. And I hadn't really understood the power of that methodology, which is that you try stuff and you try lots of stuff to see what's going to work and what's not going to work. And you do it at a scale where if it doesn't work, you don't care.
Yeah. And it seems like you could frame this as a design lesson or an engineering lesson. Since you're in the business school, I'm guessing you might agree this is also an entrepreneurship lesson. Like I can think of, like most recently, one of my guests, Emily Leering, she's a family therapist. She wanted to start a very specialized childcare program for kids and the parents who needed mental health support. This was not intended to be the run-of-the-mill daycare. Well, the phone was ringing off the hook when she announced she had a daycare, but guess what? It was people wanting just basic, typical, needed daycare. So I think the one takeaway from her story was that she was starting this as a home-based business, and the risk or the cost of then shutting it down, of realizing she wasn't finding what she thought her target market was, that was a far less costly mistake than if she had rented space, and she might have felt trapped into trying to make that work, even if that wasn't what she wanted to do.
Yeah. And I think for lots of businesses, if you start it as a side hustle, that's the least risky way to do it. Now, I'm not saying that everything can be done that way.
Yeah.
But if you can do it as a side hustle, that would be fantastic. So,
yeah, I mean, can you think of, without naming names, of course, students or people that you've mentored who were maybe being a little too stubborn instead of, too stubborn and not recognizing that early mistake that could have saved them a lot of time and expense down the road?
Oh, yeah. And surprisingly, it's the A students.
That's not surprising to me.
Well, I wish it weren't that way.
Yeah.
But the A students think they know how the world works. And so I had a young woman in one of my very early prototyping classes where she wanted to use rainwater coming off the roof to generate electric power. She was going to put a little turbine on there and have it spin. And I said, okay, how much electricity do you think you're going to get? And how do you think that's going to work? And she says, oh, this will work fine, And I said, I don't think the physics are there. I don't think that there's enough going on. And by the way, if this worked, why would it have never been done before? Part of me says a lot of smart people have thought about everything in this world at one point or another. And so I think that, we're pretty convinced at this point you can't take lead and make it into gold. And
sure.
And I said, I don't want to squelch people. I really think people ought to be able to learn for themselves. And so I told this student, you've got to get this up and running in the next week and a half and figure out if it works or not, because I don't think it's going to work. Well, supply chain issues came up, and she didn't do her initial Hello World experiment until, 10 weeks into a 14-week semester. She finished with a project, but it was a completely different project. She pivoted entirely away, which she should have done in week 2. But when you do it in week 10, it just doesn't end up looking near as good.
Yeah. And I think there's this definite trap. And when I said I wasn't surprised that it's the A students are used to knowing the answers, right? So it's one thing to understand how accounting works. Like we can know double entry bookkeeping if we wanted to, right? But knowing like that knowing trap, and I think this applies to continuous improvement or entrepreneurship, knowing versus experimenting. Like you could have a hypothesis, and that what I hear you saying, different words is, well, go test that hypothesis as soon as possible to validate or invalidate and move on or move forward or back off or adjust, right?
Yeah. So Reese, who is his first name? Can't think of it. But there's a book called The Lean Startup. And
Eric Ries. Yeah.
Eric Ries. Yeah, it was Eric. It's all about the scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually gave that book to my college president, and he read it and he says, "Oh, I never understood how business and the scientific method went together at all." Mm. It's like, now I get it. Yeah. And so, it really helped us in terms of being able to communicate, because he understood that we were using the philosophy of science, all of it, to think about how we run businesses. Yeah. And so that was a big help for us. Yeah. But yeah, if you look at any self-improvement technique, so if you look at the lean startup, if you look at the scientific method, if you look at lean manufacturing or PDCA, mm-hmm. or the DMAIC of Six Sigma, yeah. All of those, at the end of the day, involve having a theory, generating data, analyzing the data, and acting based on that data. Right. And so everything at some level that will lead to improvement is the scientific method. And what we're talking about is doing that cycle of learning much faster.
So then there's the cycle of learning that you describe in that competition. I think it's interesting that it seems like the other groups, like, were you all working out in the same space where other groups theoretically could have watched you make that mistake and then learned from it?
Yeah, so we were in a quad, mm-hmm. And the quad, like any college quad, had sidewalks running all across it. And everyone had a 4-foot square taped off on the sidewalk. And so, yeah, all of the furthest tower away from me would have been less than 50 yards. Yeah. And so we could all see what each other were doing. And interestingly, when push came to shove in that last half hour, they all looked at mine, which had been standing there for an hour. Right. And they said, let's do some of that. And so it's
some last minute benchmarking.
And they got close to my height. Mm-hmm. But they didn't quite overtake me. I kind of wish they had, but yeah. I wanted to have a good showing and have some student win, and I couldn't get there. Yeah. And it's because I had some knowledge that they didn't have, and actually developed some techniques for holding together PVC pipe that were only relevant in that particular circumstance, that they had not developed.
But you use the word knowledge, and you developed, you learned that, right? You learned from your experiments. So if everyone starts off with the same level of knowledge, there's some who say, maybe it goes back to Darwin, the business that is most adaptable to change, meaning the one that learns most quickly. This makes me think of Peter Senge and learning disciplines of really the only differentiator is how quickly do we learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, it was a point of pride for me that I bested a really good math professor and a really good physics professor working together on what was going to be a beautiful, sophisticated tower. It was amazing. Yeah. And they couldn't get it from horizontal to vertical. It fell apart.
And what you're describing, sounds like a fun, larger outdoor activity, a variation of a similar competition of using uncooked spaghetti and marshmallows, or at least two of the main ingredients of that same challenge of like build the largest tower you can in certain time constraints, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was called the Grand Challenge, and I think that the organizer just scaled all that stuff up.
Yeah,
and it was a lot of fun.
and I think one of the takeaways in the write-ups I've seen of the spaghetti tower building competition is it's said, this is probably true, kindergartners will outperform MBA students. And I said, I have an MBA, so I'm not trying to throw stones outside of my field. But they said the kindergartners were not afraid to just try things and to make mistakes, where the MBA students had maybe this analysis paralysis of we are going to think our way to the right design and then build it, as opposed to building, failing, learning, building again, moving on.
Yeah, so Tim Hartford has a TED Talk from 2012 where he talks about the God complex and trial and error. And that's exactly what he's saying, is he's saying, look, do trial and error. Don't think you know what's going on until you actually know what's going on. And I would agree with that. It turned out to be very powerful for me on the Grand Challenge.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And kind of a final thought, about that competition or that approach that, again, like it makes me think of entrepreneurship and even improvement within an organization, is that doing these small tests of change is a way of mitigating or preventing larger mistakes, like of the knowing and the bad assumption. I'll just share one example, and I'm sure you've got examples to share of. Let's say somebody in a hospital has an idea, and they want to. That involves buying something that they would have at every patient bed throughout the hospital. So now, if they've made a bad decision, if they've made a mistake, it's the cost of that times 300, and they might have to eat the cost. And I remember sort of asking and challenging, well, what's a smaller test of change? And they said, well, we could try it on one unit. I'm like, well, could you go smaller? And they're like, we could buy one. We could see how it works on one bed, and then maybe move on from there, because there were all sorts of risks of what we didn't know. Could this thing be cleaned? How durable would it be? Would people use it? It was like meant to be a way of helping patients not let their glasses and their phone and things fall onto the floor. But I think that small test of change prevented the big mistake, where then people feel stubborn of like, well, I can't admit that was a mistake.
Right, you're too invested at that point, and that's a real problem. So there's a hospital in Wisconsin that's part of the Theta Care, which it may have changed names now. I think that it was acquired. But they were in an old facility, and they actually tore 2 patient rooms out of the building, took it down to bare walls, and they put in one prototype room. It was just wallboard. There was no spackle. I mean, it was just really rough. But they then kind of put in light fixtures. They put in the bed. They said, we think we're going to have the bathroom over here on the head wall, which makes it way better. And they had everybody in the hospital could come in, and there were papers all over the wall where you could say, I like this, or I hate this, and here's what we should do about it. And so they had everybody in the building tour this one patient room before they built any other patient rooms.
Yeah.
And when they said, we hate this, they could go in and change it, because they had, a couple of 2x4s invested in it. And so to my mind, that's the way to go.
I've seen a lot of organizations, and this is spread into healthcare, of doing what we might call rapid prototyping, of using cardboard or metal with plastic sheets or something that's not concrete and drywall, to test the layout of a facility. And you can push a real hospital bed with a real person in it and make sure, like, can we actually get around that corner radius of the hallway? If we have the workbench in an exam room set up, does our hypothesis of, well, now the provider doesn't have to turn their back to the patient. Like, you could go and test those things, and it's far, far less expensive to change cardboard than it would be to rip down drywall and concrete. And we're less wedded to that idea when it's cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Kaiser Permanente has a warehouse in an industrial part of Oakland where they do exactly that.
Yeah.
They'll have whole offices mocked up inside this building.
Yeah.
Chick-fil-A does this. They were bringing out a new facility in New York City, and none of their existing designs would match kind of the cramped, expensive space of New York City. And so they built a foam core example of what they were going to build in New York City in a warehouse just off of their corporate headquarters in that'd be southwest of Atlanta.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, lots of people are doing little experiments first. And so I think my goal, with students, we always call it Hello World. Because
it's a programming thing, right?
Yeah, it's a programming thing where if you're going to learn a programming language, the first thing you need to do is be able to write 3 lines of code, compile it, and run it, and have it actually do something that you can predict in advance it will do, which is send a message to the screen that says, hello world.
Yeah.
And so, some kid comes up to me in the creative technologies program and says, I want to build a hovercraft. And you say, well, so tell me what your hello world's going to be. What's your first project going to be? And how can you get it done in about a week or a week and a half? Because if it takes longer than that, you'll never finish.
Yeah. So it could be a mistake to take on some sort of challenge like that. And again, I think we can do some things to either, if we're not preventing, we're preventing big mistakes by making small mistakes. I think there's a good lesson there. At Theta Care, I think one other quick example, a story I've heard from them, they had an idea about the need to provide transportation to patients. And the initial concept was, well, we're going to go buy a fleet of vans. But somebody had the sense, realized to say, you know what, we could rent a couple of vans and see if anyone actually calls for them. And then if the experiment didn't play out, you just stop the rental instead of being stuck with vans.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. And this is a little bit of a stretch, but I think of Adam Savage from Mythbusters. He wrote a book that's called Every Tool is a Hammer. And in that book, he recommends that when you are wanting to try a new tool, that you always buy the cheapest version of the tool that you possibly can, take it home, use it.
Yeah.
If it breaks, you've learned something. If it works and you love it and it fits your workflow really well, then you go out and buy the best tool you possibly can. But at that point, you have an understanding of what best means to you. And so
I think that physical hammer idea could apply to software. You could, like, you're trying to solve some challenge in your business. Like, we could go buy a software platform, but maybe we can start testing something kind of quick and dirty. We realize it's not going to be scalable, or we might build something in SharePoint and see if we can make the business process work around it. Would people even use it? And then go buy a better fitter for use hammer, perhaps.
Yeah.
In software. Yeah.
It really suggests that there is a disruptive option for enterprise resource planning systems, because typically you have to invest so much up front on those and then hope they work. It seems to me like if anybody brought something out that was that, just try us out and here's where you do it. And then you could build it out slowly instead of having to flip a switch on the whole thing. My local hospital, they're switching over all of their electronic systems are going to something called Epic. And they're going to throw a switch one day and hope that their organization still works. And,
it's a big risk.
If there were any way to do that, where you didn't have to have this 100% all at once cut over, it would be so much better.
Yeah.
And so much more comfortable, and you wouldn't have the horror stories that you hear.
Yeah. So let's, John, talk about mistakes. As somebody who has studied and researched and written about this for so long, maybe we can kind of go through some definitions as you have on your website, like what you call the strict definition of the word mistake, and then a more common definition. Can you kind of talk us through those and your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to get linked up with some folks who were doing cognitive psychology and looking at mistakes from a psychological perspective. And they call them errors. And then among errors, they divide it out into mistakes and slips. And mistakes are those errors that you make where you deliberate about what to do and draw the wrong conclusion. And then you do what you've intended to do, but it doesn't turn out quite right. And so a doctor misdiagnosing a patient would be an example of a mistake. They then talk about slips, and slips are where you deliberate about what to do, and then in your execution, you've got the right intent, but you do the wrong execution, and that's a slip. So they break it out that way. Now, there are finer ways to do that, but it's a good starting place.
So another example might be the mistake of choosing to do a surgery that other surgeons might consider to be outdated, and then you do maybe the wrong surgery really well, versus choosing what others might deem to be the correct surgery and then cutting the wrong ligament or something that was unintended.
Yeah, exactly right.
In the process.
Yeah. And so that's the distinction. And I think it's really useful because your response is entirely different depending on which one you're doing. And ironically, when I study mistake proofing, which comes from the obscure Japanese quality control technique called poka-yoke, when you do that, you're really working on slips, not on mistakes. And yet, when it was translated into English, they translated it mistake proofing. And once those cats are out of the bag, you really can't fix it.
Yeah.
So
there's this hierarchy, and I'm glad you clarified that, because what I hear you saying is error is kind of the highest level in the taxonomy, and then that breaks down into mistakes or slips. And I've heard, and I've probably actually used mistake proofing and error proofing as synonyms, and that's probably not technically correct.
Well, I think that, technically mistake proofing shouldn't be mistakes. So I think I try not to be a stickler about those kinds of things. If you say error proofing, I go, oh yeah, mistake proofing, poka-yoke, error proofing, all the same thing for me.
Yeah.
If you want to get down into the details of cognitive science, then yeah, there might be a difference there.
Now, there might be different settings where it's easier to prevent a slip, and some settings where it's easier to prevent a mistake. Like thinking of like a surgery setting, like you may have some sort of clinical review board that maybe helps prevent somebody making the wrong clinical decision. But then once you're in the course of surgery, you might not be able to guard against or prevent the slip of like, oh, my hand moved unexpectedly and now I've cut the wrong ligament. But you could slip proof or mistake proof slips of somebody handed you the wrong size implant for a knee, or somebody handed you the wrong medication to administer to a patient. It seems like it's maybe very situational. And how do you think through here? I'll try to phrase it as a question. How do we think through if something is preventable or not?
Yeah. And so I think that you can make inroads both on mistakes and on slips. So you can, if you make a mistake on the intent, or if you make a mistake on the execution, I think there are ways to address both, but they're different vocabularies that you use. And so for slips, there are lots of ways to do it. The way you know that you've got a slip is that you know the answer in advance. And so if you know the answer, like that's right or that's wrong, and you know it before you ever get started, that's something that you can mistake proof, or it's a slip that can be resolved. And generally speaking, those are relatively easy to fix using some very traditional kinds of mistake proofing tools. And so there's a bunch of examples in the book that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So if you want to know more about that book will walk you through it.
Yeah. And I think it's fun to think through real world examples. You mentioned Chick-fil-A, and I'm trying to think if Chick-fil-A does this. I know for sure In-N-Out does this. The food comes in a plastic tray, and they don't have to put up a sign that says "Don't throw out the trays," because the hole in the top of the garbage can is literally too small for that plastic tray to even fit. You can put your papers or food waste. I would call that, I think, good mistake proofing, as opposed to restaurants where I've been at where there's just a big open container, and then instead of saying thank you for coming here, it's like, don't throw away our baskets.
Right. And of course, the feel is entirely different.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also true that, you have lots of situations in industry and elsewhere where you use checklists. And checklists are a mistake-proofing device, but they're like the weakest one ever.
Mm-hmm.
And so you go to Pella Windows, and they actually have a little board laid out where all of the different fasteners that go with the window go into that board. There's a bright light behind it so that if there's something not there, it blinks at you. And once all of the parts are there where you don't see the light, you flip the thing over into a funnel that puts it in a plastic bag, and away you go.
Mm-hmm.
That's a much more effective kind of surrogate for a checklist than just looking through a bag of hardware and checking off that they're all there. Because normally workers will fill the bag and then go check.
Right. We've all seen.
And at that point, it's not doing its job.
I mean, I've had a checklist for running webinars and a checklist for podcasts. And where I've gotten in trouble is when, guess what? I didn't use the checklist. I thought I knew how to do this now without error. And then you get a little bit cocky and like, I don't need it. And then, oops. And that's where I think in surgical circles, they really emphasize, like, they do this in aviation. You always use the checklist, no matter how many consecutive successful takeoffs you've had, always follow the checklist.
Right. And when they get into trouble, it's because they didn't follow the checklist. Now, the way to know if you have a good checklist on your hand is if it speeds you up. Mm-hmm. And so like when I'm packing for a trip, I can spend a lot of time thinking, now, did I get everything? Do I have everything? But if I use a checklist, I can go down the list. When I get to the bottom of the list, I go, I am done. And provided that, after years of travel, that checklist has been refined to it's well done, and I have a lot of faith in it. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I have to attend to in terms of my own mental capacities is there anything unusual about this trip where I need to bring something that I normally don't bring? Mm-hmm. And then I write that down. And when I'm done, I know I'm done. Means packing for almost any length trip is 15 minutes to a half an hour at the most.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really interesting point about a good checklist should speed you up, because that's one of the concerns or the pushback you'll get. I think of the popularity of checklists or attempts at making them popular in healthcare. Dr. Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, and there's this concern of we don't have time to follow the checklist, which is an odd argument of like, well, you don't have time to do it right, and that's a little bit troubling if people are. But it sounds like it doesn't have to be either or. You can have a good checklist that doesn't slow you down.
Right. And the longer the checklist, the more doomed to death it is. Yeah. But, Peter Provost did a lot of work in the state of Michigan that led up to Dr. Gawande's book.
Right.
And he has really good evidence, that's statewide evidence, that if you think you don't need a checklist, at least in that case, he's really shown that that's not true.
Yeah.
That the checklist makes a world of difference.
And I agree with you that checklists are not the most effective, 100% effective form of mistake proofing. I think even weaker than a checklist is what I call the awareness signs, or the be carefuls, or the cautions. And so if those worked, we would hang signs in every operating room that said, like, be careful, don't operate on the wrong side of the patient. But that sign, it's like I wouldn't believe the hypothesis that sign would help.
So that leads me to the conclusion that human performance can only be improved on a marginal basis. If you need a 5% improvement, you may be able to get that from a human being by telling them to be more careful, but it's going to be transient. It's going to wear out. Mm-hmm. But then you've got this Sisyphean task of trying to keep people aware all the time. And that's just not the way the human mind works. And so it is so much better to make a design change to allow that mistake to be revealed without trying to improve the person. And, if you do that, if you can create a design feature that will help people understand that that's wrong, don't do it, that's going to work. It's a finite investment that's going to be made and be done. And you get to amortize it over however long you do that project. So it's very affordable and it will be effective in the long term. Whereas those signs that say, be more careful, will blur into the background of people's lives very quickly.
Yeah. And I think of maybe just one other example I would share. I think of, error proofing within the realm of software. I have at least a couple of times booked a flight for the wrong date. It was probably more of a slip than it was the wrong intent. And, there are attempts, like there'll be a screen that says, is this what you're intending to buy? And it's very easy just to gloss over that and say, well, of course I'm buying what I clicked. And then you find out maybe a week later, oh, I did that wrong. And now you might be hit. Well, they're not doing change fees right now, but the fare might be higher. There might be a penalty to that.
Yeah, it could be very costly.
But I think a better form of error proofing, when I think of paying a credit card statement bill either on a website or an app, I've also made the slip of accidentally paying a bill 3 days late, and now I get hit with a late fee, and now I'm getting hit with interest charges when I was intending to pay it off on time. And part of me thinks, well, maybe it's not in the credit card company's interest to prevent me from paying it late. But I think now, more recently, I think of different apps where it basically brings up a couple of very quick options of pay now, pay on due date, and then to pay on some other date might require a few extra steps. But I feel like that's at least better error proofing, or maybe auto pay would prevent that.
Absolutely.
But
and by the way, when you want to delete a file, how often do you click? You click the file name, you click delete, and then it says yes or no. And no one goes back and says, oh no, wait a minute, do I really want to get rid of that file? You've already made that decision, and now you're just executing a schema, a subroutine that involves clicking the yes button.
Well, if it's delete, though, at least on most systems, there's a good undelete. The mistake, the slip I've made is the pop-up that says, do you want to save changes, yes or no? And I'll click no. And I'm like, then those are lost forever.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, why did I click in the wrong place? Such is the human condition.
Yep. But your intent is pretty well fixed at that point, and you're executing on that intent, and your deliberation was wrong. It's much harder to mistake proof that.
But there might be a case, just thinking through, where, let's say if there was a keyboard shortcut, these dialog boxes that pop up, often if you hit the return key, it chooses one. It's probably better to choose, if you were to hit the return key, for that to activate the yes to save, because then you could always cancel out of that. If hitting the return key was like, no, I don't want to save, that might be unrecoverable.
Yeah. So one of the things that you find about good design is it's really hard to get right, because there have been times when I've made a change to something and I had an archival record and I pulled it up and I wanted to make a change for the new version, and I saved it under the archival file name. And then again, you've lost your data. So the trick is, you don't know if you really want to save the changes or if you don't want to save the changes. And so that one is much tougher. And a lot of these techniques are very subtle. And, making a good mistake proofing device ought to be easy, but you find that when you get into the nitty gritty of it, it takes a lot of thought and a lot of care. And you really ought to experiment to see if it does exactly what you want it to do, because you can cause troubles as well as fix troubles when that happens. Now, if the trouble that you cause is much less than the trouble you're fixing, that's probably a good thing. I mean, I take aspirin even though I know that it could cause a stomach upset. It never has for me, and so I continue to use it. And it's way better than feeling the pain.
Yeah. And I think of maybe just one other example here. You think of, let's say, a gasoline pump for your car versus a diesel pump. People could go and try this. It's impossible to accidentally put diesel into a regular gasoline vehicle because the nozzle is bigger. You could accidentally put unleaded fuel into a diesel vehicle, but my understanding is that putting diesel into a gas engine would be far more harmful, so they've chosen to error-proof it in that direction.
Yeah, I once had a diesel Volkswagen that a young man who was a friend of mine wanted to borrow for the prom. It was back when the new Beetle was brand new and it was just the thing. And I had one, and he wanted to drive. He drove a classic Beetle, which he traded us for 24 hours. And I said, the one thing you may not do is fill this car up before you return it, because I knew he was going to put gas in it, and it needed diesel.
Yeah.
Although Land Rover had a fix for that, where the larger caliber diesel nozzle would actually open a clamshell that would keep the gas from flowing into the tank.
Oh,
so
wow.
You get a good engineer involved, and there are lots of ways to fix the problem. Interestingly, oftentimes the way you fix the problem is by saying, how can I make this process fail?
Yeah.
But fail in a way that's benign instead of fail in a way that's terrible. And at that point, all of your failure analysis techniques become a tool to invent something new. And that's kind of a fun process.
Yeah. So I'll ask one more question before we wrap up, but I'm also just a recollection real quick. There was a period where my wife and I owned one diesel vehicle, one unleaded vehicle, and they were different, but that caused a lot of mental stress of thinking, I managed to avoid that mistake, but I'm glad maybe an electric vehicles in our future. But now we're back, no diesel, just unleaded fuel.
Yeah, it's just one less thing to worry about. So when you get your electric vehicle, then you can have range anxiety instead.
The mistake of thinking I plugged the charger in, but it was a slip, so I didn't really get it right.
So I happen to own a plug-in hybrid that's all electric, in the sense that there's no drive shaft in the vehicle. There's only electric motors. And everybody I talk to says, sooner or later, you're going to forget to charge your car.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. And so, it's an ongoing concern. Although the same is true for your phone. I find that charging my electric car and charging my phone, same process. And I happen to do them both at the same time, because routine is another way of reducing error. Just getting it to be a subroutine that you call every night at 9:30. You plug in your phone, you plug in your car, you go to bed if that's what you do at 9:30 at night.
Yeah. So John, I want to ask one other question. This comes back to terminology again. Is it a mistake to use language? We hear people say these things, foolproofing or idiot proofing or dummy proofing is another one I've heard.
So I understand what all of those mean. I choose to translate those as mistake proofing. I'm not sure I would ever correct someone if they said idiot proofing, but I think that, in Japan, when they started out with baka yoke, which was foolproofing, and a worker took offense. And I just think we live in a world where offense is easily taken and it's costly. And if you don't cause offense, it's so much better. And so, have I seen the little signs that say, if you foolproof something, the world would just come up with a better fool. It's a headwind I don't need.
Sure.
And so I choose to not correct people on that. But I also choose to not use those terms.
Sure. Fair enough. So everybody makes mistakes, even professors who study mistakes and mistake proofing. So our guest today,
I'm not just a researcher, I am a customer.
So our guest again has been John Grout from Berry College in Rome, Georgia. I do recommend his website, mistakeproofing.com. And again, especially if you work in healthcare, check out the publication, Mistake Proofing the Design of Healthcare Processes. That's a PDF that you can find freely available online. So John, thank you for those materials, and thank you so much for being a guest today. This has been a lot of fun.
Well, thank you very much.